So it's been about 19 days since Russia invaded Ukraine, and just this past weekend, a Russian missile attacked a large Ukrainian military facility near the Polish border, leaving about 35 people dead, we're told. Ukraine has accused Russian forces of killing 7 civilians who were trying to flee at the time. Russian troops are also said to be moving in on the capital, Kyiv. To help us understand these latest developments, let's bring in Ulrich Brückner, who's a Jean Monnet professor for European Studies with Stanford University, live to us from Berlin this morning. Lovely to have you on the program, sir. Thanks very much indeed for making time. Perhaps let's reflect on what's taken place most prominently in the last 24 hours. Real fears that Russian airstrikes are now essentially approaching NATO territory in the form of the Polish border. How do you think that will affect these fourth rounds of peace talks that are meant to take place in the coming hours?
Well, I don't think that it came as a surprise yesterday that military facility that is close to the Polish border, which means close to NATO territory, has been attacked, because this is what Russia has announced from the start, that they will demilitarize, as they put it, the whole country. And this was, in their eyes, an important facility because NATO officials have been involved in training of Ukrainian military. And that was seen from the beginning as a westernization of Ukraine, and so they certainly won't stop by the border. They will also not cross it, as far as we can see. And it was meant to be a signal to the West, but they are not crossing red lines.
Right. Interestingly enough, Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is calling once again for a no-fly zone from NATO because of concerns that, in fact, things may spill over into, into NATO territory. Help us better understand strategically how that would help Ukraine, if you feel it would help at all.
Well, if it would happen, it's not just a technicality that Ukraine will be a bit safer because Russia doesn't control the airspace over Ukraine, which is a huge military advantage. But it would practically mean that NATO engages and crosses a red line that it has drawn long before the war started, that it made very clear that NATO is a defense alliance and it defends its members. Ukraine is not a member, and it was not even planned to have it closer or anytime soon becoming a member. And by offering a service to Ukraine, NATO is engaged, and then we see a fight between two nuclear powers, Russia and NATO.
Right. And again, we're not even confident that even if this no-fly zone was imposed, Russia would comply. It almost feels like it might be setting Russia up for an escalation of the wars that's taking place.
Well, so far nothing has impressed President Putin, and I personally don't think that a minor change, strategically speaking, would stop him and he would give in and say, okay, sorry, now I don't have the airspace, I give up. This is certainly not what we have seen in the past in military conflicts from the Kremlin. It was rather more the opposite, that escalation strategies followed, that if you do one thing, I do more. And so NATO is very careful with what they do and how they do it. And for the time being, I don't see any move like that. Although I personally understand President Zelensky's attempt to get whatever possible to save lives in Ukraine.
Yeah. Look, future generations will undoubtedly look back at this moment. Hopefully there are lessons to take. But you spent some time studying Europe and dynamics there. I mean, given the 19 days gone by, speak to us about what you're seeing about the value or lack thereof of any kind of multilateralism. We've seen the UN speak out. The EU has weighed in and of itself. Both those influential bodies, again, as you put it, don't seem to have impressed Putin. What do you reckon that means?
Well, there are two things that we have to separate. On the one hand, I strongly believe that multilateralism and finding a way how we can be who we are and live in peace and prosper is one of the greatest achievements in the history of a continent that has a very bloody history. So we managed to form a European Union in which sovereign member states get their act together and get so interdependent that it makes no sense to attack a neighbor. This is a very liberal and multilateral concept that worked perfectly fine among the members. But we draw the wrong conclusion to believe that if we learn a lesson, everyone else follows the same path. And this was utterly wrong. We just projected our way of thinking on a leader in a country that suffers from the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. Is not the many catastrophes that actually happened, but in his eyes, it's the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he wants to go back, rewrite history, restore the dignity and pride of the Soviet Union, and uses military force. So we have to be prepared to defend what we stand for, and at the same time, there is no such thing as a military solution. So we have to do both, to trust in our soft power, which basically is the idea of diplomacy and multilateralism, and at the same time, being ready to speak bluntly and to provide hard power, because this is the only thing that apparently impresses an aggressor like Vladimir Putin.
Interesting. Part of that hard power is coming in the form of sanctions. Those don't appear to have moved the dial either. In fact, reports emerging as of this morning that there are some Russian prosecutorial authorities that are threatening countries that are thinking of imposing sanctions on Russia with arrests and the likes. I mean, outside of things like sanctions and essentially financing Ukraine's weaponry, what else can be done without getting into a full-on war with Russia?
Well, I wouldn't underestimate the dimension of these sanctions. Of course, it's nothing that works overnight, and it's also a propaganda game to present the strength of the country domestically in a way that one cannot be impressed by sanctions, because there have been sanctions before in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea. But these sanctions now go far beyond anything that happened before. And my fear is that it can also cause a major economic crash or the implosion of the Russian economy. And in a world in which we are all interdependent and interconnected, this could also lead to a global recession. We've seen already a number of sectors that are affected, like the food sector, that grain that is produced in Russia